go. Thanks. Sorry. Welcome everyone to the May 2019 MBTA Rider Oversight Committee. We're called to order now. The first item on our agenda is public comments. Wanted to see public comment right now. We'll have another chance to get into the meeting as well. I'm extremely happy that Joello, chair of the Fiscal and Management Control Board, has agreed to come and have a discussion tonight with us about the future of MBTA governance. And we'll spend time up until 6 p.m. Let's see, I think you got a bit of an introduction of who we are, so I won't spend more time on that. And as I've said to you, I'd be interested in a little bit of retrospective, how you think things have gone, to give context to where you think things ought to go. Len, were there other, just as a way to get things started, were there other particular things that you wanted?
No, it really is ideas on how he thinks the structure of governance should be once the FMCB time has expired, and also what role the Rider Oversight Committee could play to be more effective. You've given me a little bit of that already, so yeah. All right, thanks.
Great. Yeah, so if you want to just talk for a few minutes about your perspective on how we've gotten here and how you think things would work well in the future in terms of governance.
Sure.
Let's hear your thoughts about that.
Okay. So thank you all for the invitation. I appreciate it. I'll do a little bit of history, and then I'll try to be clear about where I think there is a consensus of a view among the 5 board members, and I will try to be clear about when I'm providing my own opinion that might not necessarily represent the views of the board. And even when I say there is consensus on the board, doesn't necessarily mean that all 5 members think exactly the same way, but generally that there is at least 3 or 4 of us that sort of agree directionally about where we're going. So, looking back on sort of when we arrived and where we are now 4 years later with perhaps up to 1 more year to go, I would say that it took us a great deal of time to even begin to have a sense of the rhythm of the MBTA and sort of all its complexities. My guess is we felt like we were EMTs in the first 6 months and didn't really have a sense that we were on offense at all. And when you're a board of directors, you like to feel that, boy, I understand the totality of this organization. I understand the strategy and tactics that we intend to use. And it took us 6 months to realize that despite the fact that many staff people at the T felt that we had a strategy going forward, that in fact there was no strategy. It took 6 months to sort of get to the point of understanding this firefighting could continue forever because there was no vision of what the T needed to be, and therefore if you don't have a vision, you don't have a strategy of moving toward that vision. That sort of informs a little bit about how we think about the future governance of the board. So that was sort of, I think, point number 1 for us. Point number 2 for us was, I think everybody had a good sense, including the public, about the operational troubles of the T, and also had a good sense of the financial challenges facing the T. What was surprising to us was the crisis on the human capital side of the house. There was some very good talent at the T, but not enough of it, not nearly enough of it. And the talent was going out the door every day. And that was something that had not been captured in the lead up to the formation of the board, and something that became very, very, very troubling. Related to that was that despite the fact, I think sort of 6, 8 months into our term, that we felt that there were some very good things beginning to happen at the T. Those places where we need to recruit from, and that it means the local available talent pool as well as the national transit talent pool. The T is terrible at telling its own story. And that remains a problem to this day, that we're defined by what the press reinforces about us, and that reinforcement is largely negative. We sort of deserve a lot of the bad things that are written about us, but we almost never get the good things written about us. And that's incumbent on the T to figure out how to do a better job. We still don't do a very good job about that. There is a reluctance to invest in the specialty talent, whether it's bringing them on as staff or bringing them on as consultants, to really understand how to communicate to the public about the good things that are beginning to happen at the T and what is required to keep momentum going to get to a better T. So those are, I would say, sort of some of the bigger lessons learned that we had. We, at least initially, bristled against the frequency of meetings that have been dictated by the legislation, 3 times a month at minimum, so 36 times a year. The staff certainly bristled at it. But I've got to say, at least in the first 3 years, without that discipline of meetings, without the commitment to transparency that sort of comes along with the frequency of meetings, that we would not have accomplished, the team would not have accomplished anywhere near the things that it has begun to accomplish if we did not have that time commitment imposed upon us by a third party. Much different than the DOT board, which meets once a month and tends to have a relationship with the DOT staff that is sort of floats at around 40,000 foot cruising altitude, everything is stable. When you meet frequently with the board, you become much more operational. When you have a normal working environment that certainly feels intrusive to staff, but when you have an organization that is deeply, deeply troubled, I think that intervention by the staff was necessary. And in some degree, I think, as we pivot to the future, the T is not on a pathway where you could say, sort of set it and forget it, like in the TV commercials. It is going to continue to need public oversight. By public oversight, I don't mean the board. I think the general public needs to continue to pay attention to the T, continue to challenge its practices. And I think a future board needs to be committed to meeting frequently and to welcome the kind of transparency that I think is probably the one success that we have had, which is to try to open up the doors of the T and welcome as much outside observation, intervention, criticism as is possible. So that's sort of the takeaway of what we've done. I'll try to keep my comments brief and then really go more interactive if that's okay with you. Looking forward, we have opined in our last report to the legislature about what we thought, what we think is good for the T going forward. Clearly, an MBTA only board is something that the members feel strongly about. Having that board be coterminous with the governor so that there is clear political accountability in sort of live political accountability. The current governor has the majority of the board, and that creates that political link is important. Having the secretary, so a little bit different, having the secretary being a member of the board, but not the chairperson, is something we all agree on. And probably dropping the required number of meetings from 3 a month to about 2 a month is where I think we feel pretty comfortable. The Senate has a draft legislation that you may not be aware of that is pretty close to what we recommended in the last annual report to the legislature. So 5 members, one of them being the secretary, but not the chair, coterminous with the governor. I think the Senate version, as I recall, has the governor appointing the chair, and the chair lags 6 months into the next term. So in other words, if you were to think about sort of the stabilized environment, I guess the next gubernatorial election is, what, 2022? That the governor who's elected in November, starts in January of 2023, would immediately appoint 4. Whoever the chair is will carry over to July 1st, and then carry out a full 4-year term, again ending the following July 1st. And that would be to sort of help with transition issues. At the beginning of these opening remarks, I mentioned that we were sort of lost for 6 months. I think not having every future board sort of lost for 6 months, all new members, all volunteers, having a chair committed to sort of a carryover would be important. We believe that they should be non-compensated, for the board members generally. But I would say there's some disagreement within the board on that topic. There is some sense that there should be a stipend to broaden the playing field of those who can spend time to serve on it. I will tell you this, the board members today are, there every Monday, and pretty much a full day on Mondays, and I would guess the average board member puts about a day and a half of effort into the tea every week. My guess is that if we went to every other week on meetings, that would probably be diminished, but still require a day a week of paying attention to matters, because things move pretty rapidly in the tea. I think the Senate language has an idea that we hadn't thought about, which was that we should have a professional available to the board. Right now, we are reliant upon T staff directly for any analysis of the data and all that stuff, so we sort of always go hand in hand to the general manager. We'd like someone to look at this, or hey, what happened to this issue we talked about 3 weeks ago, or was it 4 weeks ago? So that's sort of executive assistant, but really a high-level functioning professional that can do a little bit of research, a little bit of follow-up, hold the staff accountable to the board requests, etc. That notion is baked into the Senate's version of that. And that's something I think all the board members feel would really help our lives, or help the lives of the future board members to have a highly functioning professional as a full-time staff person to the board, and reporting to the board docs through the general manager or the secretary. So those are sort of our thoughts. Small board, activist board, every other week, secretary, member, perhaps some small stipend of compensation, but that's sort of an unsettled issue among the members, and certainly an executive director to the board that gives us some professional support. Those are the areas that I think we would welcome. How do you force transparency? you know, you could meet twice a month and not have a very transparent organization. I think we're not smart enough to understand how that should happen. But we believe deeply in that. Maintaining a strategic plan and being required to update it every 2 years, which we have said in practice, but is not in legislation, we think is important. And making sure your strategic plan is tied to performance outcomes that are tied to dates, right? So we don't like the gobbledygook of we shall fix the red line and the red line should carry more passengers, right? That is not our idea of strategy. Our idea of strategy is thou shalt have 3-minute headways at 95% on-time performance, with on-time performance being a very measurable, understandable statistic, and thou shalt maintain that for the next 25 years, is what our notion of is an element of a strategic plan. And I think the public should demand that. We think that should be baked into any future updates to strategic plan. We've tried our best to lock those kinds of commitments in. I'll just stick with the red line. Our intention is before we leave, we have a 3-minute headway target on the red line at 95% on-time performance, 4.5 on the orange line. We're going to publish before this calendar year is out a specific schedule of all those things that need to be completed before you can actually achieve those headway performance targets, and then we're going to publish a 25-year schedule of reinvestment that has to happen to keep that performance level at that end. Because I think the big cultural change that we have tried to impose on the T staff is that we don't buy vehicles and we don't buy signal systems. We deliver performance and service to people. Right? So we have to get away from the idea that we build things, and once we build things, great, terrific. We only build things to provide a service function, and we need to be very clear about what that service standard is. We need to achieve it, and we need to maintain that service. So I'll stop. I think I rambled and wandered a bit off topic, but
No.
so happy to answer questions or talk about specific initiatives, etc.
I'm going to go last.
I'm worried about environmental justice.
It would be helpful for me to know who I'm speaking
Karen
with.
Lipstick, I'm a member of the Rock.
Okay.
And I'm an old person.
Join the club.
Anyway, I'm concerned about environmental justice. The Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan are serviced primarily by buses. I don't consider the Fairmont line any big deal. And I'm worried the bus performances are going down. And I don't think the bus system is a glamorous system. I think that really needs better bus. There's some good things coming out of it, but if you look at what the service that section of Boston gets, it's just not up to the green line, the red line, the orange line, commuter rail, ferry, all that other stuff. It's separate, but equal, not. So I don't think it's a glamorous task to take that on, but I think you have to look, or not you, people have to focus on it, getting that service better, even if it means you've got to go away from buses and put rail down there. That's a big expense, I don't know where it would go, but obviously rail is taken away from those areas. The trolley system ran all around, the green line, 3 branches that go to Newton and Brookline are still there, but Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan is gone. Just saying.
I don't disagree. The bus system struggles, and as the community grows, traffic gets worse, and our ability to deliver on timely bus service diminishes, directly related to each other. We've been quite vocal about it at board meetings. It's not clear that that carries out outside of board meetings. If we're going to continue to utilize buses, the T only control a couple of variables.
Oh, I know.
Do we have a good bus with a well-trained driver, and do we put good amenities on the right-of-way when we get access to the right-of-way, i.e. bus shelters, et cetera, signage?
Signage is missing. I'm understanding you report it, nothing changes.
Yeah, so we don't do a good job at that last piece. We're getting better on the quality of the buses. The quality of the buses have improved dramatically. The performance of the buses in terms of email between breakdowns improved. But on time performance is slipping as congestion grows, et cetera. So what we have been trying to do is this municipal partnership, and it's not just Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. It is a whole series of other places like Chelsea and Revere and Lynn and other communities where traffic is bad and people are reliant upon buses just because of the nature of the network. So what we're hoping to change the minds of political leaders about the need to give more right-of-way to buses in the short term. Because in the short term, while folks may think we can convert to light rail, et cetera, it's the same fight over real estate, right?
Oh, yeah.
And if we can have some demonstrations that show that the world would not end if we can have a bus lane or head of the queue privileges and otherwise treat buses decently so they go faster and more people will board them, the more courage we think political leaders will have to try more and more and more and more. So we're clearly struggling with it, and we think it's a cultural mindset for the region, and we've got to just stay after it and try to do it even better. We can't run, so that's sort of running a bus, but we have a couple of other issues related to buses that are a struggle. We currently could not put more bus service on during the peak period. And the reason is we don't have enough room to store any more buses than the service that we deliver today. That's because we have a lot of older, smaller bus terminals, bus storage yards, and maintenance shops. And the moment we go to a community and say we want to buy this big piece of land and we want to put a bunch of buses there, everybody else screams, and it becomes a difficult thing for us to engage in. Now we are pushing, perhaps not as aggressively as some would like, but we're pushing at a reasonable pace the exploration of electric buses. We think if we can go to battery-powered buses, that would take away some of the objection to bus maintenance facilities, because they wouldn't make noise, they wouldn't pollute the atmosphere in that area. They would be relatively enclosed. You could build buildings on top of them and almost not notice that there's all these buses sort of hanging around. But we're probably, my guess is, from pulling the trigger on saying we will only begin ordering battery electric buses, probably 5 years away from that point, right? Because we've got a couple of tests going on, a couple of other transit agencies a little bit ahead of us who want to see how they perform. We're doing that. But finding places where we can store buses and fix buses and eventually convert to electric is another limitation on the bus network that we have today.
Thank you.
Sure.
Chair, thanks for joining us. My name is Brian. Brian Linder, also on the ROC with Karen. A couple of questions. First one, either from your perspective or the board as a whole, what's your interaction with the political leadership end? Has there been a difference between the governor's office and the legislature in terms of how they've interacted with you guys?
Sure. I would say it's evolved over time. The first couple of years, we were in, by necessity, very frequent conversation with the legislature and with the governor's office. In fact, the governor's chief of staff at the time, Steve Kadish, would spend every Friday at the tea with me. But again, that was the nature of a crisis. And I think in the first 2 years, you know, what is this beast called the FMCB? A lot of people had a hesitation about its creation. So therefore, we were called up onto Beacon Hill frequently to testify before the legislature or meet with various legislative leaders. That has diminished, and it's a natural thing that it has diminished. So we still have, I would say, very good relationships with the governor's office and with the legislative leaders. The one nice thing is that they sort of let us do our job. We know sometimes they don't like what we say, but they have never called up and said, hey, stop doing that, right? Mm-hmm. So they imbued us with a real independence, which is going to be very difficult to sustain. We got the independence because we were solving a crisis, and then the same group of people actually have been asked to sort of stay on and pivot the agency from reacting to a crisis to strategic development to get us a transit system that the region needs, not just for today, but for the next 20, 30 years. So we sort of have a little bit of political inoculation. I don't know that the next board is going to enjoy that independence, and that is something to watch for.
So you mentioned the Senate legislation is out there to make an MBTA specific board. I think my understanding is that absent that legislation, it defaults to the Mass DOT board, kind of an indirect oversight, if you will. I think personally I'm in favor of the MBTA specific board that you talked about. Is there any concern that you have that will not be the outcome? Is that a very high probability from your perspective, or is that still a risk that we would end up with a less direct oversight?
Sure. You know, there is a chance it might not happen, but I would say it's less than 10%. I think I feel sort of 90% certain that we will get an MBTA only board, and then, you know, beyond that, what his final form is, I don't know. There are certain folks who want to have the cities and towns to have a voice and say want to go from 5 to 7. All sorts of people have different ideas about what the composition of that board should be. But I do think, I feel 90% certain that there is likely to be an MBTA only board. I think the governor certainly has communicated publicly in that direction. The legislative leaders have communicated publicly in that direction. Just the final form of it is a toss-up at this point.
Thank you.
I'll speak for myself in how I've seen that sometimes our role can tend, or I'll speak for myself again. I feel like I want our group to be a little bit of a cheerleader, not just oversight, but also trying to push the positive things. You mentioned that the messaging has been not as great as it could be for getting the good message out of what progress is being made. But in your mind, is there a downside to too much of that positive messaging where people are going to consider that to be a waste of resources, just putting it into a PR machine? And how do you find that balance, in your opinion?
When I eat too many chocolate cupcakes, I feel it. So it makes me feel good. Yeah, it's a risk. It's a risk for sure. And you got to find a balance, because in reality, right, we have challenges every day, right? So there is a story that could be a headline every day about you know, a mistrip or an operator who behaved badly, or a derailment, or something, right? The complexity of the organization is so large you can have it. So you don't want to talk about how rosy things are at the T or becoming at the T, because in reality, 90% of the public is about, hey, my trip tomorrow morning is going to be any better, right? So I don't know what that balance is, right? And that's not my area of expertise, but I do think that, I'll just give you an example. You all pay attention to the T. You have any idea what the Type 10 car is? Who does? There's one. All right, so tell me why you're excited, so one of you volunteered, tell me why you're excited about the Type 10 car.
It's too long.
You think it's too long? All right.
I'm excited because it's that size.
Because it's that size. What does it do for the T?
Increase capacity.
Yeah.
Okay. Within, that's terrific, right? So here you are, advocates, you pay attention to the T on a regular basis. The simple thing about the Type 10 car is that in 60% of the length you can get 100% of the carrying capacity of 2 cars with 1 driver, right? So you cut your driving costs in half. You're also able, on stations where you could queue up 2 2-car trains, you can now queue up 3 1-car trains, and you have 50% more capacity at a station for loading and unloading. Think about Bruins and Celtics games, rock concerts, think about Fenway Park, think about other big events that happen around the city. It's an incredible change. When you combine that with other changes we're making, it's a doubling of capacity in the Green Line. Very simple thing, right? To say, I'm going to be able to buy a standard issue car, I'm going to cut my driver costs in half, and I'm going to be able to get eventually to a doubling of capacity on the Green Line, because the engineers within the T, these were engineers within the T, on their own initiative, figured out that this was a possible outcome because we gave them the freedom to use their intellectual capacity to think about solving a problem. To me, it's a remarkably transformative story about where the T is and where the T is going. And yet, I would bet in the general public of people who use the T every day, I would bet less than 2% of people know that this thing is coming. Because it's not coming for 6 years, right? And I would argue that of red line passengers, even though a newly remarkable red line is coming to them within 4 years, I bet 80% of them have no idea that the thing is coming, nor do they care that it's coming. And the question is sort of what's the balance of saying to people, sort of we understand it's not working, and we understand we have to deal with tomorrow's rush hour, but in fact there's remarkably big new things are coming. And you know, I think one tactical thing we have done, which is we've chosen not to dig up a whole bunch of new tunnels, and there's no sort of demonstration of the fact that there is a new red line coming. But in fact, for $2 billion, we're going to be building the equivalent of another red line from Alewife down to Braintree Station because we're doubling capacity. If we had a bunch of big holes in the ground and we're getting everybody mad because of traffic congestion, people would say, aha, I see progress coming. But in reality, we're using technology to give them the same thing as effectively doing that. And we're doubling capacity on the Orange Line as well. But we're not digging new tunnels, we're not doing new things, right? We're using technology and smarts to do that. But there's no physical evidence to people out there. And so therefore there's not this sense of, oh geez, at least those rats are building something new and maybe that'll work, right? We've just never figured out how to communicate it. And there's a reluctance to hire high-profile marketing and advertising firms because there's always a fear that we're going to get criticized for spending, you know, $25,000 or $100,000 on a really, really clever marketing firm, right, to tell people about this stuff. So when their bus doesn't show up in the morning, right? So that's been the dilemma. But there's some pretty radical things happening at the T.
No, go ahead. Okay, just a quick follow-up on that. You just mentioned about the Type 10s, about the engineers, I don't put words in your mouth, sort of thinking outside the box and coming up with a new design. Is that indicative of a culture shift that's happened recently where people are being allowed to think in more creative ways? I mean, was that not able to happen before X number of years ago?
I think so, and we hope so. So the notion of the red line and pushing the red line to a performance standard and public commitment on performance was driven by the board, right? We said, we're not satisfied when we're buying new cars. We want to be able to provide enough service for people who are dependent upon the service. So how do we extract the most we can out of that system? The answer was buy more cars. So utilize the option that was sort of available in the contract. And now let's improve signal systems, power systems, communication systems, and let's be able to do the red line. Then we turned to the orange line because it was the same car procurement, and we did that. We weren't even, that was driven by the board, right? And we were sort of pounding our chests. We were pretty happy with ourselves, right? The remarkable thing was the green line was never on our radar screen. Like, that did come from the staff, and that's the staff that's sort of been beaten up all these years. So hopefully that was evidence of better thinking among the staff, or of better outcomes from staff thinking, because they feel like they have the freedom to in fact put different ideas on the table. And how do you encourage that, and how do you make sure that continues to happen in the right ways is a challenge for the next board.
Well, you make it clear that there's a realistic chance that it will happen, because people aren't coming full ideas if they think there's no chance it's going to happen.
That's right.
It's a waste of time.
Yeah, you're absolutely on the money. In fact, it relates to this notion about our inability to spend the money that's been given to us on capital investments, right? So our capital investment is built into 3 buckets. There's the big construction projects, GLX, South Coast Rail, big station or parking lot reconstructions, right? Those happen within what's called the capital delivery system. Then there's vehicles, buses, trains, etc. That happens under vehicle maintenance and procurement. Both of those are doing pretty well. I would say both of those are sort of B+ enterprises. They typically hit their marks in terms of, we gave you X amount of dollars to spend it, and they're doing okay. About a third of the capital budget are small projects. You know, in a typical year, there might be a couple of thousand projects that float in, come out of 22 different departments. So the signal people say, I need to fix a bungalow over there, and the track people say, I need to upgrade the track there. There's a lot of stuff. So the second year that we were there, we actually told people, put in requests for money, and we'll give you money. We didn't realize that every previous board had said the same thing for the last 15 years, right? But when they were putting in these requests, every year they would get 0 back in their budget. So they come in, they give us the budget request, we give them the money back. The money didn't get spent the first year. So you go ask the managers, well, you asked for money, we gave you the money, you didn't spend the money. Well, that happened a couple of times before, and that was actually to bury money for another project. They didn't really do it, so we never really thought about it. The second year, same thing happens. They give us the money. They ask for the money, we give them the money. The second year they said, we said, why didn't you spend it? They said, well, we don't know how to spend it. We've never sort of had to deal with that level of money, so they didn't think about systems, they didn't think about project management, they didn't think about implementation, they didn't think about anything. Now, sort of 3 years in, they're finally realizing this is sort of a steady state environment, so their projections are better, they actually have an implementation plan, and they're getting the money, right? So it sort of relates to sort of the culture of the place, and trying to make sure that people understand that we are prioritizing those kinds of small projects.
I think you had wanted to.
Well, I've got a couple things. Do you want to go first? Okay. Hi. I'm sorry I'm late. I had a 2-hour meeting with Mass Highway and Noise Wells earlier today. Go back to Somerville and do some work and come back. But welcome. Thank you for coming. Sure. First, just anecdotally, I haven't driven my car for a year, so I'm really impressed with the buses and the bus drivers and what a job they do. I got 3 different things here. The last one is most important, but the first one is that it always bugs me a little bit that we don't look at black carbon in our climate analysis. You know, it's not a gas, so a lot of people who think greenhouse gases forget to include it, but it's 3,000 times as potent as CO2. And that alone is a good reason never to do another big diesel project. So I just lay that down. And you know, California and the International Protocol Climate Committee, they've all been doing black carbon analysis for a long time. It's second to CO2. It's in most analyses more important than methane or N2O. So it's a big gap that we're missing. And it would drive policy if we were a little bit more on top of the science here, as they are nationally in California.
So is that a Massachusetts-wide problem?
Yeah.
Or is it?
Well, it's a most state problem. The country as a whole, the international scientists, California has so much scale. They do all of that from scratch themselves.
Yeah.
They have a lot of universities that focus on air pollution and transportation. So,
But we don't measure it.
we don't
within
put it in our
Massachusetts.
models. We don't put it in our models, and that would really change our thinking. And it's been clear, you know, I was at the Kennedy School event a month or so ago, and the secretary was very aggressive in saying what we had to do, and then a week later we're approving South Coast. Those things are really at odds with each other, to be honest with you. So, you know, it's not something we can snap our fingers and change, but we really should change that.
Yeah.
We're apparently looking at 3 to 6 feet in this century of sea level rise. That's going to be a problem for Boston. I mean, they're not sure how fast Antarctica's ice is going to kind of slide, and that drives that difference. Then it's also a huge health impact. So it's a 2-for-1. If you focus on it for climate and energy purposes, you get a big health benefit.
Well, one thing to think about, so we clearly have been moving towards battery electric buses as part of that.
Yep.
This fall is going to be a presentation of a variety of alternatives on the future of commuter rail.
Yeah.
I would encourage you to come to those things and talk to the board.
I'll try to do that. I brought it up a couple times. I know how much work you have on your plate, and the secretary and everybody else, but I'll continue to do that. I appreciate the heads up.
Look for that in the fall.
Okay. The next question has to do with life cycle analysis, and I've got 2 examples. The first one that I'm concerned about, especially because it's so current, is GLX. You know, we're incredibly grateful that project is coming, the Green Line project, and it's worth any amount of short-term angst. You know, I think in almost everybody's mind, but it's got such a tight focus on the capital, and Mr. Dalton's doing a good job of that, which I appreciate. That the lack of life cycle analysis is really glaring, and where it's showing up is in the accessibility. So it's a $2.3 billion project. If 1% additional was put to accessibility, it would cut down on life cycle costs enormously. And I'll give you an example. The station in Union Square is going to be a heavily used station. Somerville has about the most carless people per square mile. Maybe Chelsea's more, but you know, with 20,000+ people per square mile, there's a lot of carless people. There's no elevator, and what that means is that whereas you could drop all the buses and the ride and everybody could drop off right at Prospect Street going into Union Square, right above the Union Square station, with just a simple elevator. You know, I can walk down. Stairway is fine for 90% of the people. But without that single elevator, we're going to lose Inman Square from the catchment basin. So we're going to use a lot of population from within whatever radius you want to speak of. But we're also taking a lot of vehicles more than half a mile off the grid around the block, or more than a quarter of a mile at least. And a huge amount of their daily time is going to be spent going off grid for lack of a drop-off. And if you do a life cycle analysis of those ride vehicles and whatever buses go off the grid and They have to basically drive 3/4 of the way around a very big urban block and drop off at the station in the back of the lot effectively, when they could just pull over in 30 seconds and drop off and be on their way. And that, so the capital blinders in this case are knocking a lot of the convenience to the population off the project, who are kind of on the fringes of being in the catchment basin, and they're also costing a lot of the life of those on-road vehicles are not going to be in service. They're going to be in this unnecessary route. Do you have any advice on and I've got another example that
Sure.
I won't go into so much detail.
Well,
Sorry, just a second, I wanted to be conscious of time.
Yeah.
We just got 5 more minutes of time, and I remember when you.
Well,
well, let me just say the fear of making a single change is because that leads to the pressure to make a wide set of changes. So we have pressures at every station to do more things. We have the bike path, pressure to widen the bike path, etc.
Right.
I would say if the community as a whole sort of said, if there's one thing we need, it's X, and we're done,
Yeah.
you'd probably have a better audience, right?
Yeah. Okay. And
So that's my only advice, is probably a great idea, but the fear is, okay, yeah, that's great,
Right.
and then all of a sudden, that's the fear.
Right. But is there an analyst at the T who would do a life cycle analysis and kind of?
Not in that way, not in that way.
Okay. Okay, now the other example, and I don't need a big comment on this, let's stop with this, but,
And I can spend a few extra minutes, so.
and I'm a doubter on BRT. So among other things, I do a lot of teaching of transportation exposure at Harvard Medical School and other places, and when I look at the best multimodal studies in North America and South America, BRT comes up with the highest exposures to people of any mode, and light rail comes up with the lowest exposures to people of any mode, and they're often substituted for each other. And I also feel like, again, in this case, light rail is going to outlast BRT by many generations of BRT. You know, so the place that it's really showing up for me now is on the urban ring, where people are no longer talking about a really good circumferential transit system that was predicted to carry about 300,000 a day, and there's a lot of substitution of radial BRT from Sullivan Square, from Harvard Alston, and they're each about 30,000 vehicles per day. So you need 10 of those to equal the old urban ring numbers, and they're not going to last as long, and they're not going to have the same regional benefit either in the core, where they'd save a lot of trips if we had the circumferential, or to the gateway cities, who all intercepted that original urban ring concept and would allow us to ship out evolutionary jobs to Lawrence and to New Bedford and to Lynn and to all the cities that should be getting those evolutionary jobs. We got to keep the revolutionary jobs in Kendall Square and a few other places, Longwood, Harvard, Alston. But the evolutionary jobs, we should be doing a better job of shipping those jobs out from the core and sharing the benefit of those jobs regionally, and also lowering the housing price peak in the core. I'll stop there. You don't have to respond. I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
That's helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want to?
Yeah, so, and, you know, we've been around a while, and we've seen, you know, lots of administrations come and go, and dealt with a lot of T-staff. So, before I make a comment, I just have a quick question about the previous board. What do you think of the shortcomings of the previous board? I mean, how can we, that you replaced, you know, and what can we do to prevent those shortcomings from materializing in whatever comes after FMCD?
Well, I just think, you know, I think there is 11 members, maybe, of the big DOT board that existed, and they had statewide responsibility, and they had registering the DOT and the highway department as well, and they're meeting once a month. I think it's awful difficult to maintain any level of focus on the team.
I think got it. So that's good. That's good. So for before the FNCB, the whole thing we saw every operating budget come out, and there was a deficit. And anytime the team would ask for more money, it was like reform before revenue. And what that involved was cutting staff. And so it wasn't surprising to us at all, to find out that a lot of things couldn't be done because we didn't have enough operating staff. And so I think as long as we are running, an operating deficit, and having pressures, on keeping staff, because right now, one of the things too is that we don't want to hire a lot of full-time staff because fully funded, it costs a lot. And so I think to a certain extent that hurts the quality of people that you can get. And society, on a society basis, we kind of destroy people because we don't really give them the security that they need for their out years, and to the extent that they can get that someplace else, they're not going to come here. So that's my comment. The last question is how can we help in this process? I said we've been around a while. We used to have more access to the GM and Secretary of Transportation. In fact, the first time the Secretary of Transportation came here, she said, "It's your job to make me come to these meetings." And you know how that is. You try making this Pollock come to anything, and you could just kind of fail. And so, but the GM is another one. And so anything you can do in terms of suggestions. It doesn't have to be now. I don't want to be in the spot now. But you have a bunch of people who do care about the system, and have a lot of background knowledge that we accumulated from lots of different staff over time. And staff has come to trust us. And it used to be that I initially, kind of was found it as too much. That's not the right word for it. Too much of a challenge to have so little power. But what I've learned now is that it's actually a good thing in helping you build relationships. And so, because if you have a lot of power, you can kind of make people do things, and then people kind of perform for you. But if you don't, if you only have influence, then you have to really build those relationships, and relationships are based on trust. And so now when people talk to us, especially in our subcommittee meetings, we feel as if we're getting a real deal on things because they trust us. And so I say that by way of saying that we do have a fair amount of good knowledge, and so it wouldn't be a waste of time for people, on a higher level to interact with us in whatever venue they feel comfortable. So we just write that word.
Sure. So a couple of things. Let me just sort of pivot off of operating costs and deficits and all of that. So there will continue to be upward pressure on operating costs going forward. So we've got, we'll have more in the next 5 years. You'll see this in July when we do a 5-year operation and maintenance forecast. Upward pressure on more red line service, orange line service, more bus service by then, green line extension comes online, South Coast Strip comes online, and other things come online, right? So that gives you upward pressure. We will have more pressure on the pension program going forward, and obviously as energy prices and healthcare prices and all that stuff sort of move, they tend to move sort of in a negative way from our perspective. They'll make things more expensive. Generally we're fighting for dollars, and this is what I try to describe to transportation activists. We've got to prove we're worth a dollar of investment because, society only has the ability to tax to a certain extent, and it has to make choices between mental health programs, education programs, water and sewer programs, etc., and transportation, right, and the T. So we've got an obligation on our side to make sure that we're operating things as cost effectively as possible. So let me just mention a couple of things that I don't think we're ever going to attack as a board, but I think a future board needs to attack, right? Number one, we spend a lot of time talking about artificial intelligence on the roadways. Okay, very difficult, complicated thing. I think most people think it's inevitable that within the next 10 years we will have automated vehicles on the roads, right? Now, you may disagree with that, but incredible progress. What about the red line, orange line, blue line? Why aren't we talking about automation there? Talk about dropping labor costs. That is a significant benefit if you can do it. We ought not to be afraid of that discussion. Number one. Number two, outsourcing. Outsourcing is controversial, privatizing, whatever you want to call it. In reality, go look at the Paul Revere bus system that operates in Winthrop today. If you're a pedestrian, a user, you walk up to a bus stop, it has a MBTA bus sign, there is an MBTA bus, there is a fare box that is the same fare box with the same transfer rules, etc. The only thing different about that bus is that the driver is not employed by the MBTA. That driver is a unionized driver. That driver has health care, the driver has a 401k package. They don't have the same benefits that they have, but they're able to attract folks in the market to provide a very, very good service. At 40% of the cost, all in, life cycle costs, that we can at the T, right? We love our relationship with the unions. We're trying to work collaboratively to move in a direction we get greater productivity. But if the system is going to expand, and it will need to expand, because we are a growing economy and a growing population, we need to think about getting cost pressures down, and automation and outsourcing ought to be two tools in the toolbox that we are able to use for better outcomes. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to serve the public, we're trying to serve the environment, we're trying to serve businesses, right? So I would just leave with those things. On the issue of communications and the work that you all do here, don't be afraid to communicate with the board, and directly or indirectly. Yeah. If you're writing a letter to the legislature about any topic you deem appropriate that relates to the T, if you're thinking about communicating on governance, on capital budgets or operating budgets or any matter, copy the board. Don't forget, we're volunteer individuals. The next board will be volunteer individuals. Most of us are lay people. We're learning about the T. We treasure, and I would hope a future board would treasure the education that you could provide to the board. So don't be shy about it, right? You have a lot of institutional knowledge here. You have a lot of perspectives that we don't always see. If a board does not hear from outside sources, we will be captured by the staff. I'm not saying the staff is good or bad or wrong or right, but it's a view. And we need to have the broadest possible view we possibly can. So communicate and encourage those of you that you communicate with to communicate with us. And in writing or coming to the board meetings, because we do read the stuff and we do listen. Yeah. And if you look and listen to how we conduct ourselves over 4 years, I think we have been greatly impacted by that communication. So I would encourage you to do more of it rather than less.
Thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time to
Thanks.
I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Can I add one thing? I hate to end it with I want to take issue with the 3 green line having 1 driver. That would mean you need proof of payment, and that's a whole other box that has to be opened.
Sure.
So it's not so simple.
It's not so simple, nor is the board. We can have a whole other hour discussion on election and all that stuff. But we got to get there. We got to get people on board fast. We got to move them along. We got to figure out how to cut costs. Proof of payment does happen in a lot of cities around the world, and we need just to adopt best practices. Today, we are losing over $40 million a year people who simply do not pay.
No, I
And we're
see
slowing
it.
everybody down with the cash stuff,
Right.
which is about 2/3 of the time not accurate, right? So
The other thing is.
6
you
of
get-
one, half of the other.
The other thing, you get people who use the T once every 2 years, don't even know how much it costs and everything, and I don't think anybody is thinking about those people.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I ran into somebody who asked me, I haven't ridden the T, but my car doesn't work, how much is the fare?
Yeah.
And so, anyway.
So I tried to explain to a neighbor of mine who's about my age, so let's just say we're over 65, how to go get a senior citizen pass. Which,
Right.
by the way, you shouldn't have to go into Washington Street Station, but if you did, I live in the town of Winthrop.
Yeah.
And it took him an hour and 45 minutes because there's no signage.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
You know, we don't communicate to the occasional passenger. It's
About anything.
a lot of things we need to fix.
Yeah, and you're gonna help fix it.
God bless the next board. That's all I
Thanks for the presentation. We'll be in touch, right?
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Right? Yeah, I hope the other board members any good? Okay, that's good.
Thanks again, Len, for looking at,
Excuse me. He's a very good,
Yeah, that's a-
very good communicator, and didn't force me to go through a little person. Almost got caned by that, Owen caned. And he just kind of slows things down, on the record. I don't care, I'm on record, I'm on record, everything I say, I'm willing to say, to the person's face. He wants to prove to me otherwise, I'll be happy to take his evidence. Being the lawyer that he is, I'm sure he appreciate that. But he just said, nope, just talk to me directly. So I think we communicated with Owen and said, no, I'm going to let you know the rest. And at that point, it's just like, real easy.
we're a couple minutes, so Joe asked to leave a bit earlier than we had on the agenda, which was why I tried to hurry things along a bit. Thanks for being patient with that. Next things on the agenda are the subcommittee reports. CIF, if anyone.
Can I actually defer? I'm just reading through my notes.
Again, I'll just summarize my notes without reading them. The issues with improving the predictions at this point, to paraphrase what he was saying, the algorithms and the technology, again, paraphrasing what Logan was saying, are the algorithms and technology that go into producing the predictions that then feed into the customer experience. The technology, the math that goes into it, have really essentially peaked. They are at the point where they're about as good as they can be. The next...
He actually said that exactly, just saying.
Okay, I'm glad I'm saying it accurately then. The next improvements to be done for the customer experience to deliver a better prediction, a better trip planning is going to be in the people issues that go into it. The crowding, the wait times. Just because the train is traveling from point A to point B to point C on time based on math doesn't necessarily mean that a person is able to get on that train to go from point A to point B to point C on time. So that's their focus for upcoming period of time. Not sure what he had in mind, but like I said, the technology is not going to get us any better customer experience. It's going to be having to focus on the sociological elements, almost. One point that he put out is that, for example, on buses, drop trips are not currently fed into the real-time system. So if a trip is dropped by an inspector who says, you know what, we can't run this trip because we don't have X or Y or Z that's required to make this trip, the real-time data system sort of just shrugs and goes, I guess there should have been a bus here, but there's no technology factoring into that human element of missing driver or the factor that led to the drop trip. Jumping into the next thing, the red line, the new red and orange line cars are going to have automatic passenger counters on them, the same types of things that are on all buses or the vast majority of buses that can detect someone getting on, someone getting off. And one thing that I'm hoping, but I'm not sure if it's part of the initial spec, is whether or not that can be fed into the real-time system to be able to provide people a sense of the quality of the service. I'm going to make sure that we follow up on that. We talked a little bit about the state of good repair database and some of the nuts and bolts that go into it. I'm going to gloss over that right now because it's not that important to our time right now. I'll wrap up by talking about the stop consolidation issues, all the factors that go into bus stop consolidation in order to hopefully provide a better service. There is a risk when the agency is doing stop consolidation analysis. There's a risk that consolidation of the stops could happen without regard to the experience getting, for example, further away to a stop, which now is further away. There's not a lot of metrics to capture how someone is going to be traveling if we've got two stops that are seemingly close together, but we eliminate one to try to make the bus route perform better on paper, mathematically. Is that going to adversely impact somebody who, instead of only going 100 yards to their stop, that one person now has to go a half a mile to the next stop? If that stop that was eliminated is a low-use stop, maybe there's only 5 people during the whole day using that stop, it might look good on paper to eliminate that stop, but you could have 5 people whose commute is essentially ruined. That's something that is not necessarily captured well by the stop consolidation process. We're going to keep an eye on that. Anything anybody wants to add who's also there? Len, how did I do for summarizing all that?
It's fine. I'll just say in terms of the reasonable limits of the technology, there is one thing that he said that the technology might be able to do, and that is if it could give you some sense of the capacity of the train behind you, so not simply how long it's going to take, but how full it is. That might help people decide that they might go for the train behind one that's coming that's packed, because if you reduce the density, once it gets to crush or to high point on the train, then boarding and getting off is faster, so that both trains would actually end up at the end point faster if people kind of waited and didn't take that first full train. So if they had a sense of how that train behind was in terms of capacity that could help people take that one and then make the system move faster with a little education. So that was a fun detail. Did great, thanks.
Thanks. So we had another recurring guest this month, courtesy of Len. We had Paul Regan from the MBTA Advisory Committee. Paul's a frequent guest of the CIP, probably joins us about once a year around this time to talk about their review of the operating budget. So Paul Regan is part of the advisory board. I think everybody's familiar, but just a little bit of a recap. The advisory board, and I might have the official title.
Yes, advisory board.
Advisory board. They represent all the cities and towns of the MBTA kind of catch basin who contribute to the MBTA's funding structure. So Paul represents all of them and looking at how the T spends its money, and kind of from that perspective. So he's much broader, he's a kind of complete view of the world, as it were. And his message was kind of similar to what Joe said in his remarks, was that we're really not out of the woods yet. He talked about, from an operating budget perspective, how we still have pressures on ridership. Definitely on the top line, revenues are decreasing. We've had some very beneficial cost savings over the last couple of years, which have helped to reduce the deficit, but those potentially might start increasing again in the future. Some of the labor costs, some things that Joe talked about, some other pressures going on as well. So kind of along those lines, one of the things that Paul highlighted was that, well, the MBTA would be successful to pursue other sources of funding. Some of the things that we talked about were potentially a deeds tax. I forget if that was something that Paul had suggested, or if that was just something on the table from.
I think the governor,
Governor had suggested that.
Yeah, I suppose, and he suggested like a certain percentage, and maybe if it's a higher percentage, we get even more revenue.
So I think what Paul had to say about that, or what the benefit of that would be, is it's a one-time tax, so it's not a recurring tax on property owners. It is kind of correspond to capturing some of the value that's been created for the properties within the MBTA basin. So a lot of the property that's close to transit has appreciated in value faster than others, and capturing a percentage of that when the property is sold is a way to fund the transit and kind of link the two versus some of the other ways on the table there.
And it's not aggressive.
Not aggressive.
Not aggressive.
Some of the other things that we talked about, I asked a couple of questions about kind of from a funding standpoint, does it make sense to link up with TNCs or blue bikes to try to kind of drive ridership that way? And I guess kind of Paul's view on that was it's tough from two perspectives. On the blue bikes, it's tough from a scale standpoint. I think the dollars involved with the blue bikes are, they're kind of everywhere, they're visible, but they're not anywhere near what the MBTA ridership is. So to make a noticeable dent would be difficult. And then on the flip side of the TNC is that the cost of the TNC is so much greater relative to the cost of a MBTA ride for certain trips. That would be tough to kind of cross-subsidize there. So still kind of a thought, but not anything that was kind of a savior going forward. We also talked a bit about the future governance for the MBTA and the advisory board, and also the history of governance for the MBTA. So from a history standpoint and from an MBTA standpoint, one of the unique factors about the MBTA compared to other transit agencies around the country is that a lot of the other transit agencies fall into a county government structure. So they're obviously the MBTA is a state agency, even though MBTA is probably about, I'm going to guess, half or more of the population. The county government would kind of more closely align with the ridership from other transit agencies. So that was a bit of a difference when Paul looked at how we're organized and how we're governing and how we have better oversight. So then kind of thinking about the future of the advisory board, I think Paul was interested in taking an active role as the FMCB went away, but there's also challenges there where he is at a different level than an MBTA specific board might be. So I know you had some thoughts on how the advisory board might play in or might be a role in future governance. Is there anything that you remember from the discussion you wanted to?
Well, I really talk about me. I just told him that I had written this letter, that he was an opening argument that gave them a lot more power than I thought they would get, but that was just to kind of start negotiating from a point where they had too much rather than starting at the point where we wanted. So that was that. But the other thing too is that he made it clear that it's an authority meeting, and the authority has the ability to do bonding on its own. So the MBTA has a lot of independence already kind of built into its legislative structure, and so it should function like that. Is essentially what he's saying. So we can still be cooperative with MassDOT and other transit entities, but we are an authority, so we have a lot of independence.
So that was my recap. I know I missed the first couple of minutes. I don't know if there's anything else that you guys had talked about earlier. Is there anything else from the meeting at all that you wanted to add?
No, I forget what we talked about, but it wasn't,
Any questions from the assembled?
he didn't say not to say anything about this, so he's retiring.
Yeah.
14 months.
Yeah, yeah. It's a-
Well, both these guys are really class acts,
Yeah.
involved.
So just be interesting to see who replaces him. I mean, he's just tough. I mean, he's big on the MPO. He's really pro-transit on MPO. Although I will say, I mean, it's not like the MPO, isn't transit oriented. I mean, there are a lot of people in MPO that are transit oriented. So it's not like he's the only person talking transit, but he's been around a while. So he's going. Carl Quackenbush just left. I mean, although I think we're gonna get a good replacement for him who's been around for a while. But hey, things change, but it's just hard with so much experience.
I think you're saying we're getting older.
Well, it isn't so much that as much as it is you just kind of feel that the knowledge you need, and so as long as to replace with people who have good knowledge, and that's why I kind of feel that the executive board, the NPO, especially if it comes from inside, will be good. And so it's more the knowledge and experience of this, because as you said, it's like you just can't come in and expect to figure this thing out, and even 6 months, it's like,
Somebody should write a book about the MBTA, an encyclopedia.
Well, that would be Jonathan Belcher.
I don't know if he knows a lot about the repair yards and all that kind of stuff.
I'm sure he does. I mean, he just segments off the small part of his brain, in our meetings. He doesn't want to dazzle us with everything.
But to Karen's point, the management history is pretty important too, like who was in power, who knew enough to thread their way through and get some things done, who was stymied. And that, I don't think of that as Jonathan's stronghold so much as just all the data.
Yeah. Right. Well, Paul Regan might be that person actually.
Yeah. Or Joe.
And I can't remember what, there's some piece of equipment at the T, and I can't remember what, that only one person knew how to repair, and that person was retiring.
Yeah.
So, do you remember?
Oh, yeah,
Lenny?
it's the Snowzilla.
Yeah.
Oh, right,
the
right,
jet snowplow.
right.
Yeah,
So they're gonna
snowplow.
have to buy all new equipment because.
Yeah, that's right, 2012,
All right,
15.
thanks for the subcommittee reports. Next thing on the agenda is approval of minutes. We got the April 23rd minutes, thank you very much. And
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
I don't know the formulation for.
You should just say,
Motion to approve.
motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Oh, I wasn't actually, okay, I made the motion, there we go, and second it.
All right.
All in favor?
Yep. All in favor?
Aye.
I'm gonna abstain, so I don't think I got the minutes.
That's fine.
Okay.
They were mailed out soon after.
Yeah.
Oh, but then I didn't read them.
Yeah.
If I read them, I forgot.
He got them out like within a week, and sent them out the day after.
This is soon his last day, too, I think, right?
Next month.
Next month. One more, okay.
Are you enjoying your experience?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, he went.
That's a
You have to say it was very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, once I hit stop on the live stream, then we'll really tell us.
It was beyond my expectations. My expectations were high.
Well, we're fortunate to have that relationship,
Oh, we
actually.
are.
So,
Definitely.
appreciate it.
Next item is reports on external meetings.
Well, I will announce, I got an email from MPO that there is going to be a meeting here next Tuesday from 6 to 7:30, regarding MPO setting up another a transit committee. So their plan is to bring in entities that are involved in transit to see what they think about creating a transit committee, and then figuring out how that committee would interface with the MPO, and members of the public who are invited. If I can make it, I'll show up. Other than that, the Regional Transportation Advisory Council met, and we talked about the long-range transportation plan, and we pretty much signed off on what they are proposing for the, I'm sorry, the TIP. We talked about the TIP, so pretty much signed off on that. And the draft LRCP, I'm not sure when it's coming out, but I don't think it's going to be too long before it comes out. The UPWP has come out, the Unified Planning Work Program has come out, and we're going to get together and talk about that soon before the next RTAC meeting.
They might vote it Thursday, the long-range plan. So their tough discussion is this coming Thursday, I think.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I'm getting mixed up. So then we've already had a draft, right? That's you're going to be voting on it?
Well, they narrowed it down a little at the last meeting, which I happened to be at.
Yeah.
And those are usually pretty, both the TIP and the long-range plan can be difficult discussions. But
right.
The long-range plan kind of sets the policy for the next, it's only done every 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So even though it doesn't fund the individual project year by year, it really sets the direction of the organization philosophically. How much is going into giant highways, which they used to say little to none recently, how much is going into transit, how much is going into town centers.
Right.
So it's important from that point of view.
So was that meeting? Something else happened. I'm sorry.
Other reports on external meetings?
I don't know if we talked about this before. I happened to go to the MIT Transportation Camp this year. Did other folks here go to that?
No.
So they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of transit enthusiasts at those one-day meetings. And I don't know, I know a couple people have gone from here before, like James went, when they were working on U-passes and things like that. But some people come very long distances, from California, from other places. And I would say that it's hard, because you can only go to one thing at a time. It's basically, the agendas, for folks who haven't been to one of these, they take a whole day. The agendas are made up on the fly. You put up ideas on a board, and there's a group that decides which ideas are going to be presented and discussed in which rooms at which time, on the fly. And but the degree of enthusiasm for people who worry that there's not people really interested in transit and walking and biking and whatever is stunning. And they started this meeting by asking everybody to say their name and 3 words in a huge audience with 300 or 400 people, and it just went right through the whole group. It's really pretty amazing.
How long did it take?
Not that long. It's actually how they started, which was an interesting thing to do. I've never been in a meeting that did that before. It took maybe 20 minutes. They had 2 mics on both sides of the large meeting room at the status center, and so everybody was queued up to go right after the person before stopped. There were some young kids who were really enthusiastic.
Did they do anything with that data?
Well, that's a good question as to what happens. And I have to say, I don't think that many things happen out of it. On the other hand, I think a lot of people probably think about these things in isolation, and when there's a meeting like that, they kind of realize how many people are out there working on similar topics. And there are people who were embedded in transit agencies, not just from around here, but from a lot of places. And then there are academics there, there are enthusiasts. It's a pretty interesting thing, and it's such a positive event compared to, you know, much day-to-day and year-to-year stuff. So I just mentioned that. So if you see it another time and you're inclined to go, I would encourage you to go.
How much does it cost?
Nothing.
Oh.
I don't think, well, I might be wrong. Maybe there's like a $10 charge or something. There's good food all day long. There's good food all day long. There's like breakfast and lunch. And
What 3 words did you say?
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
Yeah, well,
Were those your 3 words?
that should be my 3 words the next time. I'm just too scattered in what I do every week that, you know, it's like 50 meetings back.
Yeah. That does sound wonderful. I'd love to go to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting just for the positive aspects of it, I would say.
And what month was it?
It was about, it's always on a Saturday. I would say it was about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, so.
So May.
It's just when the weather starts to get good.
Well, actually, the thing I was trying to remember is that it wasn't at the RTAC meeting, it was at the last MPO meeting I went to, and that is that they are planning on, I think it seems like they are planning on doing the initial studies, maybe for the blue line extension to Len. Was that, do you remember that, Mike? Or was it the red line blue connector? There was one of those.
Oh, red line blue connector is definitely on track to be studied.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about blue.
Okay, so it's the red line, blue line, yeah, because I mean, someone asked me, because I mean, there's like for the LRTP, there was like the transit part of it, which they
Right.
hadn't really, you know, given a proportion to it.
Right.
And they said, well, actually, this is kind of being pulled out of the MPO and taken on by MassDOT? Is that right?
I think that sounds right.
Yeah, so it seems like that's
Yeah.
momentum outside MPO, and so I'm beginning to kind of wrap my brain around how the MPO fits into the transportation system. I still don't have the overall picture, like MassDOT is everything, but then, you know, what part of it controls beyond MPO and how it fits into the various MPOs will come to me.
Yeah. Well, so MPOs are federally mandated. So every urban area in the U.S. has to have a metropolitan planning organization whose process and key federal documents are determined by the Clean Air Act and the National Surface Transportation Funding bills. So the Boston MPO is about half the population. There's 12 others in the state. The other 12 are much different because the land use planning is attached to the transportation planning. In Boston alone, it's not. MAPC is somewhat separate, but they are in every urban area in the country, and they must prescribe the service transportation funding has to run through the MPOs in the U.S. Things like the blue line to Lynn can be affected by political, you know, the politics can say, you know, to the secretary or to the legislature, you have to study this, and they can do that outside of the MPO. That's optional. The MPO is not optional.
Right. But, so does every federal transportation dollar spent in a state have to?
On surface transportation, not aviation and not shipping.
So every federal dollar for surface transportation is spent by?
That's significant, yes.
So significant is like what threshold?
Well,
Is it 5 million, 10 million, 20?
in this case, I think what it means is there's an automatic federal share of much of what goes through the MPOs. So that's why they're tied to the periodic but somewhat non-standardized federal bills that just come out when they run out of money and there's enough momentum in Congress that they do a new reauthorization, and they change the name and a few other things. But all of those official federal funds that have sharing formulas nationally have to run through MPOs. There's no choice.
Right. But then the state has its own funds. I mean, we still.
Yeah, and the
we still
state
have
can
to-
do things on its own, like most of our commuter rail extensions, because they are completely non-compliant with the Clean Air Act, cannot get federal money. So those are generally completely on the state, and it probably doesn't matter. They're folded into the regional plan, but they're not getting federal dollars. We're paying for 100% of them. If they're diesel, you're not going to get any federal money.
Hell, so, still something, when my brain kind of freezes on the bulk side, is that when I deal with the MPO stuff and through the RTAC, it's still not really clear to me what the state's doing, and I feel as if I need to have a good sense of what the state is doing in order to say, what the MPO should do, even if the state doesn't have to, abide by whatever guidelines the MPO has, because if we're all going to work together to solve or to make transportation better, I kind of need to know what they're doing. It doesn't seem like the state feeds enough information into the MPO for at least me to know.
Yeah.
Feel good about it. And so it may be that I'm just not clued in enough.
Len has accurately described several times the three things that are federal requirements that the MPO does. So one is the UPWP, which is a collection of studies. And that's it, studies, but they can become projects down the road. The second one is every year they do the Transportation Improvement Program. That's exactly how many dollars, assuming things stay on track, are going to be spent on each project. And then the third thing is the long-range plan, which is only done every 4 to 5 years. All of those are federal conformity processes and documents, and they have to be reviewed and approved by the federal service transportation agencies.
And by the way, the UPWP is up for review, so I'm waiting until we have the RTAC has this 3C committee, because part of the process that the vets want for the MPOs is called this 3C process, which stands for comprehensive, continuing, and cooperative. And it's a process thing, although I would like to see it more of an operating thing, but that's another issue, another time. So I want to meet with them before coming up with the letter that we will submit. I'll ask this now though. Would it be, how do you feel if I sign off my name on behalf of the Ride Oversight Committee? And I do that not because I want to put my name out there, but because I guess it feels a little more accurate what's going on. I don't really want to write 2 letters because it'll be really clear that I'm just writing 2 letters. And I can say the rock, I can just put the rock on it.
Wendy, I want to interrupt now. If we're going to sign off on the letter, we have to know the letter, we have to review it, we have to vote on it. If you want to send a letter, fine, but don't send it on behalf of the rock unless we all vote on it.
Well, no, you can vote on it. It's just a matter of how I would sign it. So you still vote on it. It's just a matter of whether I would sign it.
When are we going to see the letter?
When I write it, which will probably be
Well,
after.
why don't we pass
Let me answer the
cross
question. I'm
that
going to
bridge
answer the
when we
question.
get to it?
I'm going to answer the question, and that will be after the 3C committee has met, and before the deadline. So I'm hoping we will meet, next week. So they may give us a week to do it. But I'm happy not to.
How are we're not going to meet before another month?
Right. So it has to be done through email.
No.
Okay.
That's my own opinion, no.
Yeah, well, then it's a matter of how the rest of the group feels about it. Because
Of course.
if you all don't want to, I'm fine to do it on my own. I think it puts the rock in a better light. Then it's really just a matter of whether there's a little more accurate reflection of what's going on in the process, where that I'm writing it on behalf of the group to sign off on it, or whether I just put the group's name on it, which kind of implies that the group has had more more interaction on it, you know?
I don't have a problem personally with your being sort of the face of the rock when we're writing letters. However, I do think that we all have to, as we've done in the past, everybody sees it and makes their comments.
Yeah.
And I don't think you're trying to skirt that at all. And I personally am fine with it if you want to, if you're the face of the rock or anybody here. I don't have any issues on that. The one thing that I'm concerned about, however, is that if we're gonna end up like deliberating over the letter, not outside of a formal meeting, and that concerns me. But in general, and I'll let everybody else say what they think, I'm perfectly fine with having one person be sort of the face of the rock. And, but I'm a little concerned with trying to have us deliberate outside of the meetings. But that's just my 2 cents.
I'm comfortable with whatever way the group feels. I want to be clear though, RTAC and MPO are separate. So RTAC is a place to discuss interesting things, and RTAC has a seat at the MPO except for the federal votes. The RTAC has no vote when it comes to the federal vote crunch time. RTAC is not allowed to vote. So there's a big difference between putting a letter into the MPO, which is a formal federal and state process, and putting in a letter to RTAC, which is an advisory process.
Yeah, but we'd be sending a letter, you know, to the MPO.
Yeah, and I'm happy however the group.
Right. So we've just got a couple more minutes before the second public comment period.
If the concern that was raised is about doing the review of a formal letter only by email, and if there's a concern about doing it outside of regular public meeting scope, I believe one option is, per the bylaws, to have a special purpose committee. What's the name of the?
Ad hoc.
An ad hoc committee. So I guess the general question is, could an ad hoc committee do the review of such a letter within the time frame that we have in mind, whoever's involved, and B, could that ad hoc committee meet in an electronic form, like over a telephone bridge, so it's available to people who don't have email access or computer access, but have phone access instead?
I think not under public meeting law.
Okay.
All right. Well, you know, what I'll do is I will, when I put the letter, I'll put it out there, you know, and I'll see how the discussion goes, you know, and I'm gonna write the letter only once, and it's really a matter of how it's signed. It can be signed by me only, you know, it can be signed by me on behalf of the Rock, it can be signed by the Rock, and however many responses I get will determine what happens, and we'll see what we lost with this.
Probably individuals can sign on to this, not as, you know.
Yeah, right, people can write their own letters, me too. You
Yeah,
know?
or sign on to yours.
Yeah.
There are probably some issues with public meeting and ethics law. On the body.
It just strikes me as odd that writing a letter and agreeing on it would have to be within a public meeting. I mean,
Yeah, this is not common sense, this is compliance.
Right. I think the problem is, are we deliberating, are we discussing something?
yeah.
Can we,
Have you written the letter yet?
No, I haven't, because I need to meet with I want to meet with the 3T committee, you know, in order to get more input. I haven't written that, I'm going to the letter, so one of the things I did before is about new co-chairs.
yeah, my term ends with next meeting.
Right.
Carl, I don't know where Carl's comes in or ends, because he came on a month after. So I don't know if we keep Carl or if it's supposed to, if we rise and fall together.
Well, I would say we can keep. Do you want to stay for another month? Do you want to stay for another 6 months after that? Sure. Okay. So then, does anyone else want to do it when you know Amy leaves?
Who's not?
Right. You know, then, I mean, what we'll do, I figure is that, if no one wants to do it, then the other person will just be drawn from the executive committee, I mean, based on availability, and that's, because if folks want to participate in leadership, if not, then the executive committee do it, and until they get tired of the executive committee doing it, and the person who yells and screams about that will be the person that gets to be the
Is there anyone who hasn't done that?
I don't think that I've been co-chair, but I'm not interested in being co-chair of the ROC.
You'd be a great co-chair.
Thank you. Thank you for the.
Carl's a really great guy.
Maybe if Carl Plank could never take the action to run every meeting, you can be co-chair.
Yeah.
What about you, Karen?
Oh, no, I did it in my time.
I have
Time
done,
again.
I've done two 1 year
I've done
full
2 or
rock
3.
co-chair. It's been a while though, but I'm not against it. I'm just not stepping up because I often feel like when I've got this in front of me, literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
being a co-chair as well. Just, I mean, but I'm not against it. If you think I can.
The other alternative, I just am thinking now, we could just have everybody take a turn. Not for the whole 6 months, just 1 month. Carl be it, and then co-chair be, everybody get a turn, rotating. I don't know.
That would be okay. I mean, what do you two think? You've been most recently in the seat. I actually think the subcommittee heads have more work often, but I mean, that's just based on my own role in your seats. It may be more work for you, and I've been a slacker.
I don't have strong opinions, having just started it, but I do want to make sure before we get to 7,
Yeah.
we don't need to decide this right now, correct?
Yeah.
We do not need to decide this right now.
But the discussion is helpful. Closing public comments. Either or both of you. We just- yeah.
Well, the gentleman was here first, so whatever. I'll defer to him now.
Barry Steinberg, Association for Public Transportation. I'm reacting to something that Stefan mentioned about stop consolidation. On the 52 route on Baker Street, it goes through an area that's undeveloped. And there's a bus stop sign not far from an intersection. And on the bus stop sign, there was a notice that they're considering eliminating this bus stop. A similar situation on the 211 that goes from Quincy to Squantum. There was also a sign. I don't know the result of the measure, but also an area where there is not too much of a development. And my question is, what are they saving by eliminating the bus stop? The bus is going to run past there anyway. And if you have one person standing there, it saves them from walking a half mile to the next bus stop. I'll leave it at that.
That's exactly the question.
Yep.
Very well said, yes. Thank you, Barry.
Hi, I actually didn't have any really prepared comments, but I'd just like to mention that we're kind of at the 11th hour now in terms of the fiscal year. Fares going up once again, July 1st. I am not happy at all about this. I did make comment at the fiscal control board meetings and whatnot through my elected officials, and unfortunately it was not able to be stopped. I'm still hoping that the governor will come and rescue us at the 11th hour. If I do remember right, I think back in 2006, 2007, there was a large attending fare increase, and at the time, Governor Patrick canceled the fare increase at his discretion. I'm not going to hold my breath, but I'm hoping that there may be a Hail Mary at the last minute. But I just want to say, I do believe that keeping fares equitable is extremely important, and having fares that are affordable public transportation is the single most determining factor in alleviating poverty and having upward mobility and allowing folks to get an education and improve their life, and it's a great leveler of the society, of the playing field. And when fares keep creeping up and becoming unaffordable, especially in relation to other modalities, it's going to push people off the system. And anecdotally speaking, I know folks that are looking at a $300 to $400 commuter rail pass at this point, and anecdotally they've told me that they may not be riding the team longer. So I'm just really hoping that ridership does not go down because of this, and I mean that would be a terrible thing in terms of our carbon goals that we have set in Commonwealth, and pollution, traffic, and everything that we know is bad. So I'm sure this board has already made plenty of recommendations that fares not go up, but I don't know if there's anything we can do at this point, but I just wanted to
You give us too much credit. I don't think we've taken a stand on the fare increase. So, thank you.
So, I mean, I don't know if there's a last minute appeal to the governor's office or lieutenant governor's office and about pushing it back or something. I don't know if that's even possible. It's a month away. But on my level, I have just been reaching out to my elected officials, and
Just speaking for myself, I think the only Hail Mary involved would be if the legislature can pull some funding out of thin air in the form of either gas tax or tolls, because from everything that I've been reading, that's where the inequity is, because they haven't changed in 15, 20 years, but the MBTA fares have been going up. But it's up to the legislature. Again, my opinion only.
Well,
Thanks very much for coming and talking that comment.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you, and go Brewers. All right.
And Red Sox.
Do we have time for me to throw in a couple things without discussing them? Just throw them out here for this part.
We have a minute and a half.
Okay. So just on that, you might try, you or we or whoever might try to grab that casino fine. I mean, there's going to be a lot of focus on congestion in Everett with the casino opening, and they just added a $35 million fine that could probably help people who need a little bit of fare. Just to comment on the bicycle T connection, it's worth remembering that in Copenhagen and Aarhus, Denmark, there are as many bicycle trips as vehicle trips. The total is the same, it's 50-50. And they're a lot further north than we are. But it took them a while to get there. On fares more generally, I can't believe how many fare boxes are broken on the buses. I don't know how much money they're losing, but it's just stunning. And it's not just 10% of the riders. The bus I took to get here, 100%. This fare box not working, everybody gets on free. And it's a really packed bus. And then lastly, just to go back to the climate and transportation, transportation is double energy climate impact, energy generation climate impact. It's vastly bigger than buildings in Massachusetts and the United States. And we have 20 times the offshore wind capacity that's reachable with current technology of our total electric use. And Maine has 40 times. Those are the two states that are in the capital C. And if anybody thinks of a way that I could participate or other people could participate in really pushing the state to take advantage of that available electric energy, and to, one, make money for the state, and two, couple it to transportation, and especially transit, not just, people are starting to think, even in MassDOT, that it's all gonna be about electric vehicles. Well, they're just gonna drive up the total VMT, and half the emissions aren't tailpipe anymore. So you can have an electric vehicle, you're still getting 50% of the emissions out of every vehicle. And if we could just hook that up to transit and make some money off of it and have a long-term energy source for transit, if anybody knows how to do that, I'd be interested. Thanks.
So the boot camp is for next year.
Yeah.
Sorry, drinking my name for the conference. Oh, okay, yeah.
Does anybody move to adjourn?
Yes.
Second? Any opposed? All in favor?
All right.
Okay.
We've never had an opposition to that.
Yeah.